Sister Margaret Rose had lived at St. Catherine's Convent for 43 long years. At 72 years old, her body showed every sign of her devoted service to God. Her back was bent from years of scrubbing floors and tending to the sick. Her hands were rough and weathered from working in the garden and washing countless dishes. Deep lines marked her kind face, each one telling the story of prayers whispered in the dark and tears shed for others. But despite her aged appearance, there was something special about Sister Margaret that most people never knew. Hidden beneath her humble exterior was a secret that had kept her spirit alive through all these years of simple convent life. She could play the piano like an angel, every night when the other sisters had gone to sleep and the convent was wrapped. In peaceful silence, Margaret would slip out of her small room. Her bare feet would make no sound on the cold stone floors as she made her way through the dark hallways. She knew every step by heart, every corner and doorway, even in complete darkness. This was her sacred journey, the one thing she did, just for herself. The old piano sat in the main hall of the convent like a sleeping giant. It was a beautiful instrument, made of rich, dark wood that gleamed even in the moonlight. The keys were made of real ivory, yellowed with age but still smooth under her fingers. During the day, the piano was mostly ignored. The younger sisters were too busy with their duties, and the older ones considered music a luxury. They could not afford that, but Margaret knew this piano was special. She had discovered its magic shortly after arriving at the convent as a young woman. 29. Back then, she had been full of dreams and music. She had studied piano at a famous music school in the city before deciding to give her life to God. Many people had told her she was making a mistake, that she was throwing away a brilliant career. But Margaret had felt called to serve others, to find God in a life of prayer and service. When she first found the piano, it had been covered in dust and badly out of tune. The previous Mother Superior had told her that no one had played it for years, but Margaret saw its potential. Slowly, carefully, she had worked to restore it. She tuned it herself, polished its wood until it shone, and replaced broken strings with her own money. It became her project, her secret passion. For 43 years, Margaret had kept this routine. Every night, she would play softly, her fingers dancing across the keys like old friends meeting again. She played everything she could remember from her music school days. Bach, Chopin, Mozart, Brahms, all the great composers spoke through her weathered hands. She also created her own music, melodies that came from her heart and seemed to express things that words never could. The music was her prayer, her way of talking to God when regular words felt too small. When she played, Margaret felt young again. She felt connected to something bigger than the small world of the convent. The music took her to places she had never been and reminded her of dreams she had set aside, but never completely forgotten. The other sisters knew Margaret was special, but they did not know why. They saw her kindness, her gentle way with the sick and troubled people who came to the convent for help. They noticed how she always seemed peaceful, even when times were hard. What they did not know was that Margaret's peace came from those precious hours at the piano, when she could let her soul fly free through music. Margaret was careful never to play too loudly or for too long. She did not want to wake anyone or cause trouble. She had always been obedient, always followed the rules. But this one small rebellion, this quiet time with her music, was something she felt God had given her. It was her gift, her way of staying connected to the part of herself that was more than just a servant. The piano became her closest friend. She talked to it silently, shared her worries and joys with it. When young sisters came and went, when Mother Superiors changed, when the world outside the convent walls grew stranger and more complicated, the piano remained constant. It was always there, waiting for her in the darkness, ready to receive whatever music her heart needed to share. Margaret's playing had grown more beautiful over the years. All the experiences of her long life, The sadness of losing family members, the joy of helping people heal, the quiet satisfaction of a life lived in service. All of these emotions flowed into her music. She played with a depth and feeling that came only from decades of living, loving, and serving others. Sometimes, on special nights when the moon was bright and she felt particularly inspired, Margaret would play for hours. She would lose track of time completely, her spirit soaring with the melodies that poured from her fingers. These were her happiest moments, when she felt most alive and most connected to the divine spark that she believed God had placed in every human soul. But Margaret always knew this beautiful secret life could not last forever. She was getting older, and her fingers were not as quick as they once were. Sometimes her arthritis made playing painful, though she never let that stop her completely. She had begun to worry about what would happen when she could no longer make the nightly journey to the piano, or when her hands could no longer find the right keys in the darkness. What Margaret did not know was that her secret was about to be discovered. What she could not imagine was that the very thing that brought her so much private joy was about to become the source of public shame and conflict. The peaceful life she had built around her music was about to be shattered by someone who did not understand that sometimes the most beautiful prayers are the ones that are sung rather than spoken. As Margaret played her last free night at the piano, her fingers moving through a gentle lullaby she had composed years earlier, she had no idea that everything was about to change. The music filled the silent hall like incense, rising up toward the high ceiling and the sleeping God she had served so faithfully for so many years. Tomorrow would bring the end of her musical freedom, but tonight, she was still able to speak to heaven in the language her heart knew best. The morning that would change Sister Margaret's life forever started like any other day at St. Catherine's Convent. She woke before dawn, as she had done for 43 years, and made her way to the chapel for morning prayers. But there was something different in the air that day, though Margaret could not put her finger on what it was. The autumn wind seemed to whisper secrets through the old windows, and even the birds sounded more excited than usual. After prayers and a simple breakfast of bread and tea, Margaret went about her daily duties. She helped in the kitchen, tended to the small garden behind the convent, and spent time with Sister Catherine, an elderly nun who had been bedridden for months. Margaret read to her from religious books and held her frail hand, bringing comfort. Through her gentle presence. It was around 2 o'clock in the afternoon when everything changed. Margaret was in the garden, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants, when she heard a loud knocking at the front door of the convent. The sound was urgent, almost desperate. She looked up from her work, dirt still clinging to her hands, and wondered who could be visiting at such an unusual time. The knocking continued, growing more insistent. Margaret realized that she might be the only sister available to answer the door. Mother Superior had gone to town for supplies, and most of the other sisters were busy with their afternoon duties. Margaret quickly washed her hands at the outdoor pump and hurried toward the front entrance, her long habit swishing around her ankles as she walked. When she opened the heavy wooden door, Margaret was surprised to see a well-dressed man standing on the doorstep. He was tall and handsome, probably in his 40s, with carefully styled dark hair and expensive clothes. His face was flushed with frustration, and beads of sweat dotted his forehead, despite the cool autumn air. Behind him, Margaret could see a sleek black car with its hood raised, steam rising from the engine like smoke from a dragon's mouth. "Please," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Margaret could not identify, "I need help. My car has broken down, and I have no cell phone signal here. I have an important engagement tonight in the city, and I'm already running late." Margaret's kind heart immediately went out to this stranger in distress. "Of course," she said, stepping back to invite him inside. "Please come in. We can call the local mechanic for you, and you're welcome to wait here while we sort things out." The man seemed surprised by her immediate offer of help. He stepped into the simple entry hall of the convent, his expensive leather shoes clicking on the worn stone floor. "Thank you so much," he said, some of the tension leaving his voice. "I'm James Morrison, and I'm truly grateful for your kindness." Margaret led him to the small parlor where the convent received visitors. It was a modest room with simple wooden furniture and religious paintings on the walls. She gestured for him to sit in one of the plain chairs while she went to call the mechanic. As she dialed the number, she could hear James speaking quietly on his phone, which apparently had found a signal inside the building. "Yes, I know I'm supposed to be there for sound check in 2 hours," James was saying, his voice tight with worry. "But my car broke down in the middle of nowhere. I'm at some kind of convent. Yes, a convent with nuns. Look, just delay everything. If you have to, I'll get there as soon as I can." Margaret returned to the parlor after reaching the mechanic, who promised to come out within the hour. "He'll be here soon," she told James with a reassuring smile. "Would you like some tea while you wait? And perhaps something to eat? We have fresh bread and some honey from our own beehives." James looked at this simple elderly nun with growing amazement. In his world of concert halls and luxury hotels, people were usually kind to him because of his fame and money. But this woman was offering help without even knowing who he was or what he did for a living. "That would be wonderful," he said softly. "Thank you." As Margaret prepared tea in the small kitchen adjacent to the parlor, James found himself relaxing. For the first time in weeks, his life as a world-famous concert pianist was constantly busy, filled with performances, travel, interviews, and pressure. He was always rushing from one city to another, one concert hall to the next. But here in this quiet convent, surrounded by peace and simplicity, he felt something he had almost forgotten: true calm. Margaret returned with a tray holding a simple white teapot, 2 cups, thick slices of homemade bread, and a small jar of golden honey. As she poured the tea, James noticed her hands. They were weathered and lined with age, but there was something graceful about the way she moved them. They reminded him of something, though he could not quite place what. "I hope you don't mind me asking," Margaret said as she settled into her chair, "but what kind of engagement do you have in the city tonight? You seem very worried about being late." James hesitated for a moment. In his experience, when people learned he was a famous pianist, they either became starstruck and awkward, or they immediately wanted something from him. But there was something so genuine about Margaret's interest that he decided to be honest. "I'm a pianist," he said simply. "I have a concert tonight at the Symphony Hall. It's part of a tour I'm doing across the country." Margaret's eyes lit up with genuine interest, and James was relieved to see that she didn't seem impressed by his fame. Instead, she looked curious and pleased. "How wonderful," she said. "Music is such a beautiful gift. Do you enjoy traveling and performing for different audiences?" As they talked, James found himself sharing more than he usually did with strangers. There was something about Margaret's gentle questions and genuine interest that made him want to open up. He told her about his childhood, learning piano from his grandmother. He talked about the challenges of performing, the loneliness of constant travel, and his love for music that had sustained him through difficult times. Margaret listened with the kind of attention that made James feel truly heard. She asked thoughtful questions and made encouraging comments that showed she understood something about music and the artistic life. As they talked, James began to sense that there was more to this humble nun than met the eye. "Do you play any instruments yourself?" James asked, noticing how Margaret's face seemed to glow whenever they talked about music. For a moment, Margaret's expression changed. A shadow crossed her face, and she looked down at her hands wrapped around her teacup. I used to," she said quietly, "but that was a long time ago." Something in her voice made James lean forward with interest. "What did you play?" he asked gently. Margaret was quiet for so long that James wondered if she had heard his question. Finally, she looked up, and he saw something in her eyes that he recognized, the look of a musician who had been separated from their music. "Piano," she said softly. "I used to play piano." Before James could ask more questions, they heard the mechanic's truck pulling up outside. But as they waited for news about his car, James found himself thinking about Margaret's hands, her interest in his music, and the sad look that had crossed her face when she mentioned playing piano. He had spent his whole life around musicians, and he was beginning to suspect that this humble nun might be hiding a musical secret that was bigger than either of them imagined. The mechanic's news was not good. James's expensive car would need a new part that had to be ordered from the city, and it would not arrive until the next morning. James ran his hands through his hair, looking more stressed than ever. His concert was in just 3 hours, and he was still 2 hours away from the city, even if he had a working car. "I can drive you to the city," the mechanic offered, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "My truck isn't fancy, but it runs good. It'll cost you extra though, since I'll have to close my shop early." James quickly agreed, even though he knew the old pickup truck would be quite different from his luxury car. But as he gathered his things and prepared to leave, he found himself reluctant to say goodbye to Sister Margaret. Their conversation had been the most peaceful part of his day, and he felt like he was leaving something important unfinished. "Sister Margaret," he said, turning to her as the mechanic waited by his truck. "You mentioned that you used to play piano. I hope you don't mind me asking, but why did you stop?" Margaret's face went pale, and she looked around nervously as if someone might be listening. It's complicated," she said in a whisper. "I'm not supposed to talk about it." James felt his curiosity growing stronger. As a professional musician, he had learned to recognize when someone had a deep connection to music. Margaret's reaction told him that there was much more to her story than she was letting on. Would you like to see our piano before you go?" Margaret asked suddenly, surprising herself with the invitation. "It's really quite beautiful, even though no one plays it anymore." James's eyes lit up. "I would love to see it," he said, then turned to the mechanic. "Could you give me just 10 more minutes? I promise I'll be quick." The mechanic nodded and settled against his truck to wait. Margaret led James through the quiet hallways of the convent, past simple rooms and religious paintings. As they walked, James noticed how Margaret's whole demeanor seemed to change. She walked a little straighter, and there was a light in her eyes that had not been there before. They entered a large, high-ceilinged room that served as the main hall for the convent. Natural light streamed through tall windows, and the space had a peaceful, almost sacred feeling. But what caught James's attention immediately was the piano dot. It was a magnificent instrument, a full-sized grand piano made of rich, dark wood that gleamed in the afternoon light. James approached it slowly, his trained eye taking in every detail. This was not just any piano. This was a truly exceptional instrument, the kind that belonged in a concert hall. "This is incredible," James breathed, running his hand along the smooth wood. "I've played on some of the finest pianos in the world, and this is as beautiful as any of them." "Who takes care of it?" Margaret's cheeks flushed pink. I do," she admitted quietly. "I keep it tuned and polished. It deserves to be treated with respect, even if it doesn't get played very often." James lifted the lid and pressed a few keys gently. The sound that came out was pure and rich, with the kind of tone that only the finest pianos could produce. "The tuning is perfect," he said with amazement. "You did this yourself?" Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. James played a few more notes, then a simple melody. The music filled the hall, echoing off the high ceiling and stone walls. It was beautiful, but James found himself thinking that this piano was capable of so much more than simple melodies. "Margaret," he said, turning to face her, "you have an extraordinary instrument here. It's criminal that it sits silent. Surely someone in the convent must play." Margaret shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "Mother Superior says music is a distraction from prayer and service. She believes that older sisters like me should focus on spiritual matters, not worldly pleasures. James felt a flash of anger. Music isn't a worldly pleasure, he said firmly. Music is one of the most spiritual things in the world. It connects us to something divine, something bigger than ourselves. As he spoke, James began to play more complex pieces. His fingers moved across the keys with professional skill, and the piano responded beautifully. He played a piece by Chopin, then switched to Bach. The music seemed to transform the entire room, filling it with emotion and beauty. Margaret stood frozen, her hands clasped tightly together. As James played, tears began to stream down her face. Her body swayed slightly with the music, and James noticed that she seemed to know every note before he played it. When he reached a particularly difficult passage in the Bach piece, he saw Margaret's fingers moving slightly, as if she were playing along in her mind. Suddenly James stopped playing and turned to look at Margaret directly. "You know this piece," he said. It was not a question. Margaret wiped her tears with her sleeve, nodding. "Yes," she whispered. "I know it very well." "How well?" James asked gently. Margaret looked around the empty hall, then back at James. Something in his kind eyes made her want to tell the truth, even though she had kept her secret for so long. "I studied at the conservatory," she said in a voice so quiet that James had to lean forward to hear her. "Before I came here, I was going to be a professional pianist. I had already given my first public recital when I decided to join the convent instead." James's mouth fell open. "You were a trained pianist?" "A professional?" Margaret nodded, more tears flowing. "I gave it all up to serve God. I thought I was doing the right thing. But I never stopped loving music. For 43 years I've been playing this piano at night when everyone else is asleep. It was my secret, my way of staying connected to that part of myself." "Was?" James asked, picking up on her use of the past tense. Margaret's face crumpled. "Mother Superior found out. She forbade me from playing. She said it was inappropriate for a woman of my age and position. The piano has been locked for 3 months now." James felt his heart breaking for this woman who had sacrificed so much. "Margaret," he said softly, "would you play something for me? Just one piece?" Margaret looked terrified. "I couldn't. I'm forbidden. If Mother Superior found out." "She's not here," James said gently. "And I promise you, no one will ever know. Please, Margaret. I've spent my whole life around musicians, and I can see in your eyes that you have something special. Don't let fear rob the world of your gift." Margaret looked at the piano, then at James, then back at the piano. Her hands were shaking, but she could feel the pull of the music like a physical force. It had been 3 months since she had played, 3 months of silence and emptiness. "Just one piece," she whispered, more to herself than to James, with trembling steps. Margaret approached the piano bench. She sat down slowly, her weathered hands hovering over the keys. For a moment, she just sat there, as if gathering courage from somewhere deep inside herself. Then, with a deep breath that seemed to come from her soul, Sister Margaret began to play. Sister Margaret's fingers touched the piano keys for the first time in 3 long months. The moment her skin met the smooth ivory, something magical happened. It was as if an electric current ran through her entire body, waking up parts of her soul that had been sleeping in darkness and silence. She began with a simple piece by Bach, the same prelude she had played on countless nights when the convent was asleep. But even from the first notes, James could tell this was something extraordinary. Margaret's touch was not just technically perfect. It was filled with decades of suppressed emotion, longing, and pure love for music. As Margaret played, her entire body seemed to transform. The bent shoulders that showed her 72 years straightened with grace and dignity. The worried lines on her face smoothed away, replaced by an expression of pure peace and joy. Her eyes closed, and she seemed to enter a world that existed only in the music flowing from her fingers. James stood perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break the spell. He had heard thousands of pianists in his career, from students to world-famous masters. But what he was witnessing now was something different, something that could not be taught in any music school or learned from any teacher. This was raw talent combined with a lifetime of deep feeling, all pouring out through music that had been locked away for too long. Margaret finished the Bach piece and, without stopping, moved into a Chopin nocturne. Her fingers danced across the keys with surprising strength and speed. The arthritis that troubled her during daily tasks seemed to disappear completely when she played. Her hands moved like those of a woman half her age, guided by muscle memory that had never forgotten the patterns and rhythms she had practiced so many years ago. The music filled the great hall, echoing off the stone walls and high ceiling. Each note seemed to hang in the air like a prayer, creating layers of sound that wrapped around James like a warm embrace. He found himself holding his breath, afraid that breathing too loudly might disturb the perfection of what he was hearing. As Margaret played, tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of pure joy, of coming home after a long journey, of finding something precious that had been lost. Her whole being seemed to glow with happiness as the music poured out of her like water from a dam that had finally burst. When she finished the Chopin piece, Margaret opened her eyes and looked at James. "I had forgotten," she whispered, her voice full of wonder. "I had forgotten how it feels to really play." James wiped tears from his own eyes. "Margaret," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "that was the most beautiful playing I have ever heard, and I have heard the greatest pianists in the world." Margaret smiled, a real smile that lit up her entire face. "There's one more piece," she said. "Something I wrote myself years ago. I've never played it for anyone else." Without waiting for James to respond, Margaret began to play again. This time, the music was completely original, flowing from her heart and hands in a way that seemed almost supernatural. The melody was simple but deeply moving, like a conversation between Margaret and God, played out in notes and harmonies that spoke truths too deep for words. The piece told the story of her life, the joy of discovering music as a young woman, the difficult decision to give up her career for religious service, the years of quiet devotion, the secret nights at the piano, and the recent months of enforced silence. But it also spoke of hope, of faith that had never wavered, and of love that had grown stronger through sacrifice. James listened with his heart pounding. As a composer himself, he recognized that he was hearing something truly special. This was not just a good piece of music. This was a work of art that came from the deepest part of a human soul. Margaret was not just playing the piano. She was speaking her life story in a language that transcended words. The music built to a powerful climax, Margaret's whole body swaying with the passion of the piece. Her fingers flew across the keys with complete confidence, never missing a note, never hesitating. She played as if her life depended on it, as if this might be her last chance to let her soul sing through music. As the piece neared its end, Margaret began to slow the tempo, bringing the music down to a gentle, peaceful conclusion. The final notes hung in the air like a blessing, slowly fading until the hall was filled with a silence that felt sacred and complete. Margaret sat with her hands still on the keys, breathing heavily, her face glowing with exhaustion and joy. James stood in complete amazement, unable to find words for what he had just experienced. "Margaret," he finally managed to say, that was beyond anything I could have imagined. You're not just a pianist, you're a true artist. The world needs to hear your music." Before Margaret could respond, they heard footsteps in the hallway outside the main hall. Margaret's eyes went wide with terror, and she quickly pulled her hands away from the piano as if it had suddenly become burning hot. "Oh no," she whispered, her face going pale. "Someone's coming." The footsteps grew louder, and both Margaret and James could tell they were moving with purpose toward the main hall. Margaret stood up quickly from the piano bench, smoothing down her habit and trying to look as if she had been doing nothing wrong. "Maybe it's just one of the sisters," James whispered. But even as he said it, he could see the fear in Margaret's eyes that told him this was not going to be a friendly encounter. The footsteps stopped right outside the door to the main hall. Margaret and James looked at each other, both knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. Margaret had broken her vow of obedience, and there would be consequences. The door to the hall swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the entire building. Mother Superior Catherine stood in the doorway, her face stern and her eyes flashing with anger. She was a tall, thin woman in her 50s, with sharp features and a manner that commanded immediate respect and fear. "Sister Margaret, Mother Superior," sighed, her voice cold and controlled. "What exactly is going on here?" Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She stood frozen next to the piano, her hands shaking with fear and shame. All the joy and peace from her playing had disappeared, replaced by the crushing weight of being caught in disobedience. James stepped forward, his instinct to protect. Margaret overriding his unfamiliarity with convent rules and hierarchy. "Mother Superior," he said with as much respect as he could manage, "please don't be angry with Sister Margaret. I asked her to show me the piano, and then I convinced her to play. If anyone is to blame, it's me." Mother Superior's cold gaze moved from Margaret to James, taking in his expensive clothes and confident bearing. "And who exactly are you?" she asked, her tone suggesting that she was not impressed by his attempt to defend Margaret. "My name is James Morrison," he said, straightening his shoulders. "I'm a concert pianist, and I can tell you that what Sister Margaret just played was the most extraordinary music I have ever heard. She has a gift that is truly divine." Mother Superior's expression did not soften. "Mr. Morrison," she said icily, "I don't care if you're the most famous musician in the world. Sister Margaret has violated a direct order, and there will be consequences." Margaret finally found her voice. "Mother Superior," she said quietly, "I'm sorry. I know I disobeyed you. But the music, it felt like prayer. It felt like the most honest conversation with God I've had in months." The three of them stood in tense silence, the beautiful piano behind them seeming to wait for whatever judgment would come next. The silence in the great hall stretched like a tight rope ready to snap. Mother Superior Catherine stood in the doorway, her stern face showing no emotion except disapproval. Margaret trembled beside the piano, waiting for the punishment she knew would come. James felt the tension in the room like a physical weight pressing down on all of them. "Sister Margaret," Mother Superior said slowly, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife, "you have directly disobeyed my orders. I specifically forbade you from playing this piano, and yet I find you here, making music as if my words meant nothing to you." Margaret's head hung low in shame. "Yes, Mother Superior," she whispered. "I disobeyed you. I'm sorry." But James could not stay quiet. Everything in him rebelled against the idea that Margaret should be punished for sharing such beautiful music. He had spent his entire adult life in the world of music, and he knew greatness when he heard it. What Margaret had just played was not just good, it was extraordinary. "Mother Superior," James said, stepping closer to where she stood. "With all due respect, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Sister Margaret is not just a good pianist. She is an artist of the highest level. What I just heard was some of the most beautiful, most spiritual music I have ever experienced." Mother Superior's cold eyes turned to James. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate that you are trying to help Sister Margaret, but you don't understand our ways here. We are a religious community dedicated to prayer, service, and obedience. Music is a distraction from these sacred duties." James felt his frustration growing. "But that's exactly my point," he said, his voice becoming more passionate. Music isn't a distraction from spiritual life, it is spiritual life. When Sister Margaret plays, she's not turning away from God. She's having the most honest, most beautiful conversation with God that I've ever witnessed. Mother Superior frowned. That's a very romantic view, Mr. Morrison, but it's not romantic. James interrupted, forgetting his manners in his eagerness to defend Margaret. It's truth. I've traveled all over the world. I've played in the greatest concert halls for kings and presidents and thousands of people. But I have never heard anyone play with the kind of pure spiritual connection that Sister Margaret has. Margaret looked up at James with surprise and gratitude. No one had ever defended her like this, especially not to someone in authority. But she was also terrified that James's words might make Mother Superior even angrier. Mother Superior was quiet for a long moment, studying both James and Margaret with sharp eyes. Finally she spoke. Mr. Morrison, you say you're a professional pianist. Are you someone of importance in the music world? James nodded. I perform internationally. Tonight, I'm supposed to give a concert at the Symphony Hall in the city. But, honestly, after hearing Sister Margaret play, I'm not sure my concert will be worth attending. That's not true, Margaret said softly, speaking for the first time since Mother Superior had arrived. Mr. Morrison is being too kind. I'm just an old woman who plays piano in the dark. No, James said firmly, turning to face Margaret. You're not just an old woman. You're one of the most gifted musicians I've ever encountered. Your technique is flawless, but more than that, you play with a depth of feeling that comes from a lifetime of faith and service. You don't just play music, you channel something divine through your hands. Mother Superior watched this exchange with growing curiosity. She had expected to find Margaret sneaking around, perhaps playing simple hymns or childhood songs. She had not expected to find a famous pianist praising Margaret's abilities in such glowing terms. Sister Margaret, Mother Superior said, her voice slightly less cold than before. Is it true that you studied music professionally before coming to us? Margaret nodded hesitantly. Yes, Mother Superior. I studied at the conservatory. I had planned to make music my career, but I felt called to serve God instead. And you've been playing our piano for 43 years? Yes, Mother Superior. Only at night, when I wouldn't disturb anyone. I tried to be respectful. Mother Superior walked slowly into the room, approaching the piano where Margaret still stood. Play something for me, she said suddenly. Margaret's eyes went wide with shock. Mother Superior? I want to hear for myself what Mr. Morrison is talking about. Play something. Margaret looked terrified. Her hands shook as she approached the piano bench again. She sat down carefully, her fingers hovering over the keys. After a moment's hesitation, she began to play Ave Maria, a piece that seemed appropriate for the religious setting. From the first notes, it was clear that James had not been exaggerating. Margaret's playing was indeed extraordinary. The familiar melody became something new and beautiful under her touch, filled with years of prayer and devotion. She played with such tenderness and reverence that even Mother Superior felt tears coming to her eyes. When Margaret finished, the hall was quiet except for the echo of the final notes fading away. Mother Superior stood still for a long time, processing what she had heard. Sister Margaret, she said finally, her voice much softer than before. Why didn't you ever tell me you could play like this? Margaret looked confused. You said music was inappropriate for someone my age. You said it was a worldly distraction. Mother Superior sighed deeply. I said that because I thought you were just playing around. I had no idea you had this level of ability. This isn't just music, this is a form of worship. James seized the moment. Mother Superior, I have an idea. I know this is very unusual, but would you consider allowing Sister Margaret to perform with me tonight at my concert? The world needs to hear her gift. Both Margaret and Mother Superior looked shocked. "Oh no," Margaret said quickly. "I couldn't possibly. I'm just a nun. I don't belong on a concert stage." "Yes, you do," James said with conviction. "You belong anywhere beautiful music is needed. And I can promise you that what you have to offer is more beautiful than anything else that will be heard tonight." Mother Superior was quiet for several minutes, thinking carefully. Finally she spoke. "Sister Margaret, what do you want to do?" Margaret was stunned by the question. For 43 years, she had followed orders without question. Now she was being asked what she wanted. I would like to share my music," she said quietly. "If it could bring joy to people, or help them feel closer to God, then I would like to do that." Mother Superior nodded slowly. "Then you have my permission and my apology. I was wrong to forbid you from playing. I see now that your music is indeed a form of prayer." 3 hours later, Margaret stood on the stage of the city's Symphony Hall, still wearing her simple black habit, her weathered hands resting on the keys of a magnificent concert grand piano. The audience had been told only that there would be a special guest performer, and they murmured with curiosity at the sight of an elderly nun at the piano. James introduced her simply as Sister Margaret, a woman whose music will touch your souls. Then Margaret began to play. The concert hall, filled with 800 people, fell completely silent as Margaret's music washed over them. She played her own composition, the piece she had shared with James that afternoon. But now, in front of a large audience, the music seemed even more powerful. People in the audience began to cry. Some closed their eyes and swayed gently with the music. Others sat in complete stillness, afraid to move lest they break the spell. Margaret's music spoke to something deep inside each person, reminding them of love, hope, and the beauty that exists even in the midst of ordinary life. When Margaret finished, the silence lasted for nearly 10 seconds. Then the audience erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. People stood, clapped, cheered, and many continued to cry. Margaret sat at the piano, overwhelmed by the response. The video of Margaret's performance was posted online by someone in the audience. Within days, it had been viewed millions of times. People shared it with messages like, "This is what music is supposed to be, and I haven't cried like this in years." Margaret became an overnight sensation, proving that talent and beauty have no age limit. But perhaps the most important change was at St. Catherine's Convent. Mother Superior removed all restrictions on Margaret's playing. The piano was never locked again. Margaret spent her remaining years sharing her music with anyone who wanted to listen, teaching the world that it's never too late to let your gifts shine, and that the most beautiful prayers are sometimes the ones that are sung rather than spoken. Margaret's story became a reminder that when we follow our authentic gifts and use them to serve others, we serve God in the most honest way possible. Her music had been silenced for 3 months, but when it was finally set free, it touched thousands of hearts and proved that true art is always spiritual, no matter where it comes from or who creates it.